Hey there, adventure seekers. Today we're plunging into the murky swamps of Guyana to hunt down the largest snake on planet Earth, the giant anaconda. And no, this isn't some Discovery Channel clickbait where they promise you a monster and deliver a garden hose. We're talking about a creature so massive that local tribes have legends of travellers walking alongside what they thought was a jungle wall for 2 days, before realising it was a snake's body. Sounds insane? Yeah, that's because it kind of is. Now I know what you're thinking. Anacondas, been there, seen that in a questionable 1997 movie with Ice Cube. But here's the thing. The real anaconda makes Hollywood look like amateur hour. We're following an expedition team armed with drones, underwater robots and infrared cameras as they venture into waters where you're either the hunter or the lunch special. Spoiler alert, the jungle doesn't care how expensive your equipment is. So before we dive into this watery nightmare, smash that like button if you're ready for some genuine wild content, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I want to know who's brave enough to join me in anaconda territory. Alright, let's get into it. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a country where rivers don't just flow, they conspire. Where waterways twist and turn and double back on themselves like a GPS having a complete nervous breakdown. Welcome to Guyana, a sliver of land tucked into the northeastern shoulder of South America, sandwiched between Venezuela, Brazil and Suriname. This is a place where the word road is more of a suggestion than a reality, where dry land is basically a rumour, and where the jungle has been doing its own thing for millions of years without asking anyone's permission. Guyana is roughly the size of Britain, but here's the kicker. About 80% of it is covered in pristine rainforest that has never seen a chainsaw, a bulldozer, or even a particularly ambitious hiking trail. The interior is so remote that there are indigenous communities who have had more contact with jaguars than with the outside world. And somewhere in this vast green labyrinth of rivers, swamps, flooded savannas, and impenetrable vegetation lives the creature we're here to find, the green anaconda, the heaviest snake on Earth. The stuff of nightmares and apparently several very questionable movies from the 90s. Now before we go any further, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the snake in the swamp. When most people hear anaconda, their brains immediately conjure images of a 50-foot monster launching itself out of the water to swallow boats, helicopters, and the occasional B-list actor whole. Thanks, Hollywood. Really appreciate the scientific accuracy there. The truth is both more mundane and somehow more terrifying. Anacondas don't chase speedboats. They don't have a personal vendetta against documentary crews. But what they do is arguably creepier. They wait. They lurk in murky water, sometimes for hours or even days, with only their eyes and nostrils breaking the surface. They are ambush predators of the highest order, patient as monks and about 1,000 times more dangerous. The expedition we're following was organised by a wildlife researcher named Victor Hendricks, a man who has spent the better part of 2 decades wading through some of the most inhospitable environments on the planet in search of apex predators. If you asked Victor what his hobbies were, he'd probably say something like not dying and finding things that could kill me. Accompanying him on this particular adventure into the Guyanese wilderness are 3 equally unhinged individuals. First there's Santos, the local guide. Santos grew up in one of the riverside villages that dot the Rupununi region, and his knowledge of the land is so encyclopedic that he can tell you which specific log a caiman was sunning itself on 3 Tuesdays ago. His job is to keep everyone alive, which given the circumstances is roughly equivalent to being a lifeguard at a volcano. Then we have Dr. Elena Vasquez, a herpetologist from Caracas, whose specialty is, you guessed it, really big snakes. Eleanor has handled more venomous and constricting reptiles than most people have had hot dinners, and she approaches each encounter with the calm demeanour of someone who has long since made peace with the universe. Her scientific expertise is invaluable, though her tendency to describe 8-foot snakes as cute little guys does raise some questions about her baseline for normal. Rounding out the team is Marcus, the cameraman. Marcus's job is to document everything, preferably without dropping the extremely expensive camera equipment into the swamp. He's done wildlife shoots on 6 continents and has the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has seen things that involve teeth, venom, and very poor cell phone reception. Why Guyana, though? Why not the Amazon proper, or the Pantanal in Brazil, or any of the other South American wetlands where anacondas are known to lurk? The answer lies in isolation. The interior of Guyana is one of the least explored regions in South America. The rivers here aren't highways, they're obstacles. The forests aren't parks, they're fortresses. This means that the wildlife has had centuries to grow, hunt, and reproduce without significant human interference. Local indigenous groups, particularly the Makushi and Wapishana peoples, have lived alongside these creatures for generations, and their oral histories are filled with stories of anacondas so large that the idea of measuring them seems almost pointless. According to some accounts, these snakes can reach lengths of 10, 12, maybe even 15 meters. Now, officially, the longest scientifically verified anaconda was somewhere around 8.5 meters, which is already longer than most studio apartments. But the locals insist that bigger ones exist, deep in the flooded forests where researchers rarely venture. That's exactly where Victor's team is headed. Getting to the interior of Guyana is an adventure in itself. The journey begins in Georgetown, the capital, a charmingly chaotic city on the Atlantic coast, where colonial architecture crumbles alongside modern buildings, and the traffic follows rules that appear to be entirely theoretical. From Georgetown you have options, none of them good. You can take a small plane to one of the interior airstrips, assuming the weather cooperates, which it often doesn't. Or you can drive, though the word drive implies roads that actually exist in a recognizable form. What you actually do is bounce along rutted tracks that alternate between ankle-deep mud and spine-compressing rock, all while the surrounding vegetation attempts to reclaim the path in real time. Victor's team opted for a combination approach: fly as far as possible, then switch to river travel. This sounds romantic until you realise that river travel in Guyana means spending hours in a small aluminum boat with an outboard motor, navigating channels that sometimes narrow to the point where the vegetation on either side brushes your shoulders. The water is brown, not from pollution, but from tannins leached out of decaying plant matter. It looks exactly like tea, smells faintly of decomposition, and conceals everything beneath its surface with perfect opacity. You could be floating 3 feet above an anaconda the size of a sedan, and you would have absolutely no idea. Pleasant thought, right? The team established their base camp in the Rupununi Savannah, a vast grassland that floods seasonally, transforming from African-style plains into something resembling the Everglades during the wet season. This transitional environment is prime anaconda territory. The snakes move between permanent water bodies during the dry season and spread out across the flooded landscape when the rains come. Right now, in the early wet season, the anacondas are concentrated around rivers, ponds, and swampy depressions, which makes them theoretically easier to find. Theoretically. In practice, finding an anaconda is like trying to spot a single olive green rope in an Olympic swimming pool filled with mud. Except the rope can move, the pool is actually a swamp, and the rope might decide to eat you. This is where the technology comes in. Now here's where things get genuinely exciting, because this isn't your grandfather's wildlife expedition. Victor's team came prepared with an arsenal of gadgets that would make a Silicon Valley startup jealous. First up, the drones. These aren't your standard consumer quadcopters that your neighbour uses to spy on backyard barbecues. These are professional-grade units equipped with high-resolution cameras, thermal imaging capabilities, and GPS tracking systems that can pinpoint their location to within a few centimetres. The idea is simple: fly over the wetlands, scan for heat signatures or visual sightings of large snakes, and mark the coordinates for ground investigation. Simple in theory, anyway. The problem is that drones and tropical environments have a relationship best described as adversarial. Humidity is the enemy of electronics, and Guyana's humidity hovers somewhere between steam room and actually underwater for most of the year. The heat doesn't help either. Batteries drain faster in high temperatures, motors work harder, and the whole system basically operates in a permanent state of stressed exhaustion, much like the humans using it. Then there's the rain. This is the tropics, where the weather can shift from blazing sunshine to apocalyptic downpour in approximately 11 seconds. One moment you're getting beautiful aerial footage, the next your expensive drone is performing an unscheduled aquatic landing in a caiman-infested pond. But the drones are just the beginning. The team also brought underwater ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, essentially tiny submarines with cameras that can explore beneath the surface, where human divers would be, well, lunch. These little robots can navigate through murky water, squeeze into tight spaces, and record everything they encounter without putting a single human life at risk. In theory. In practice, the underwater environment of Guyana's wetlands is essentially an obstacle course designed by someone who hates technology. Submerged logs, tangled root systems, floating vegetation, and zero visibility combine to turn every ROV deployment into a tense game of, will we get the robot back this time? Then there's the thermal imaging equipment. Anacondas, like all reptiles, are ectothermic. They rely on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature. This means that under certain conditions, they show up on infrared cameras as warmer or cooler patches against the background environment. At night, when the snakes are often more active and the ambient temperature drops, thermal imaging can reveal serpentine shapes that would be completely invisible to the naked eye. The team mounted thermal cameras on everything, handheld units for ground surveys, fixed installations for monitoring specific areas, and even adapted a small remote-controlled car to carry a thermal rig into vegetation too dense for humans to enter. Watching a tiny RC car trundle through the underbrush with a thermal camera strapped to it like some kind of apocalyptic toy is simultaneously the most ridiculous and most ingenious thing you'll ever see. The problem, naturally, is that thermal imaging has limitations. It works best when there's a temperature differential between the target and the environment. In the sweltering heat of midday, when everything, rocks, water, vegetation and snakes, reaches roughly the same temperature, the thermal advantage disappears. Rain also creates problems, as does dense vegetation that blocks the infrared signature. And then there's the issue of false positives. Do you know how many things in the jungle generate heat? Everything. Literally everything. Decomposing plant matter generates heat. Termite mounds generate heat. That log you thought might be a snake. It's been sitting in the sun all day, so yes, it also generates heat. The team spent their first few days chasing thermal signatures that turned out to be rotting stumps, confused caimans, and on one memorable occasion, a capybara that seemed deeply offended by all the attention. But here's the thing about technology. It's a tool, not a solution. Victor understood this from the beginning. All the drones in the world can't replace local knowledge, and all the thermal cameras ever made can't substitute for the instincts developed over a lifetime of living in this environment. This is why Santos was so crucial to the expedition. While Marcus fiddled with drone settings and Elena-calibrated sensors, Santos would simply stand at the edge of the water, watching, listening. He could tell from the behavior of birds whether something large was moving beneath the surface. He could read the patterns of ripples on the water like sentences in a book. He knew which pools were likely to hold anacondas based on factors so subtle that he couldn't even articulate them. He just knew. The first few days of the expedition were frankly humbling. The team had arrived with their high-tech equipment, their satellite communications, their freeze-dried food packets and waterproof everything, and the jungle proceeded to systematically dismantle their confidence. Drone number 1 suffered a motor failure during the second flight and had to be retrieved from a tree using a system of ropes, prayers, and creative profanity. The underwater ROV got tangled in hyacinths on its inaugural deployment and required 3 hours to extract. 2 of the thermal cameras developed moisture inside their lenses, rendering them useless until they could be dried out, which in 95% humidity takes approximately forever. The satellite phone worked intermittently at best. The generator attracted so many insects that it had to be covered in netting, which then caught fire. Twice. Santos, to his credit, did not laugh, or at least not where anyone could see him. He simply continued doing what he'd always done, paddling quietly through the channels, scanning the banks, checking the places where his father and grandfather had found big snakes decades before. And it was Santos, not the drones or the robots or the thermal cameras, who found the first significant evidence of what they were looking for. On the morning of day 4, he called the team over to a muddy bank near a permanent lagoon. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a track. Not a footprint. Anacondas don't have feet, obviously, but a belly track, a wide depression where something massive had hauled itself out of the water and across the mud before sliding back into the depths. Victor measured the track. It was nearly 60 centimetres wide. For comparison, a typical garden hose is maybe 3 centimetres in diameter. A baseball bat is about 7 centimetres. A large dinner plate is roughly 25 centimetres. This track was wider than 2 dinner plates placed side by side. The snake that made it was not a cute little guy. It was not a garden hose. It was something else entirely, something that belonged in the nightmares of medieval cartographers who used to write "Here be dragons" on unexplored regions of their maps. The team stared at the track in silence. The jungle pressed in around them, humid and green and utterly indifferent to their ore. Somewhere in that brown water, in that tangle of vegetation, in that primordial chaos of life and death, something enormous was waiting. The hunt was officially on. That track by the lagoon changed everything. Suddenly the expedition wasn't just a wildlife survey anymore, it was a genuine pursuit. But Victor knew something that every experienced field researcher understands. You can't find an apex predator by looking for the predator. You find it by understanding its world. To locate the giant, you first need to comprehend its kingdom. And the kingdom of the green anaconda is nothing short of spectacular. The Rupununi wetlands of Guyana aren't just a habitat. They're a universe unto themselves, a complex and brutally efficient machine of life and death that has been running without maintenance for millions of years. Picture this. During the dry season, the savanna stretches out like an African grassland, golden and vast, punctuated by islands of forest called bush islands that dot the landscape like green ships on a yellow sea. Termite mounds rise from the grass like ancient monuments, some of them taller than a person, home to colonies that have been building for decades. The rivers shrink to their channels, exposing sandbars and mudflats where caimans bask and jabiru storks stalk through the shallows on legs that seem borrowed from a very elegant ladder. Then the rains come, and everything changes. The transformation is so dramatic it's almost impossible to believe unless you've witnessed it. Water rises from everywhere, from the rivers, from the ground itself, from the sky that opens up and doesn't stop for months. The savanna becomes a shallow inland sea, connecting ponds and rivers and lagoons into one vast aquatic network. Fish that were trapped in isolated pools suddenly have access to an entire continent of water. Birds arrive in numbers that darken the sky. And the anacondas go from concentrated to dispersed, spreading out across this temporary paradise like they own it. Which, in a very real sense, they do. Let's talk about the food chain here because it's genuinely insane. At the base you have the usual suspects, insects, plants, plankton, the tiny building blocks of any ecosystem. Then you get the herbivores, and this is where Guyana starts showing off. Capybaras are everywhere. These oversized guinea pigs, and I mean oversized, we're talking about rodents that weigh up to 70 kilograms, are basically the cheeseburgers of the wetland world. Everything eats capybaras. Jaguars eat capybaras. Caimans eat capybaras. Anacondas absolutely love capybaras. If you're a capybara in Guyana, your primary life skill is being nervous, and honestly, that's entirely justified. Then there are the agoutis, which look like someone tried to design a deer but gave up halfway through and made it rat-sized instead. Pacus, their nocturnal cousins, are equally abundant and equally delicious to anything with teeth. Giant anteaters wander through looking like they got lost on their way to a Jim Henson movie set. Tapirs, imagine a pig that wanted to be an elephant but couldn't commit, crash through the underbrush at night, their prehistoric snouts twitching as they search for fallen fruit. Peccaries travel in herds, and while a single peccary might seem like an easy meal, a herd of 30 angry peccaries with tusks is something even jaguars think twice about. The point is, there's no shortage of food. This ecosystem is basically an all-you-can-eat buffet for anything capable of catching a meal. Moving up the chain, you hit the mid-level predators, and this is where things get interesting. The rivers and lagoons are absolutely crawling with caimans. The spectacled caiman is the most common, a modest-sized crocodilian that tops out around 2.5 meters and has eyes that make it look permanently surprised, which, given what else lives in these waters, is probably appropriate. But the real star of the caiman world is the black caiman, and this animal deserves a moment of respect. Black caimans are the largest predators in the Amazon basin. Full-grown males can exceed 5 meters and weigh over 400 kilograms. They are essentially dinosaurs that refuse to get the extinction memo, and they eat anything that fits in their mouths, which, given the size of their mouths, includes a disturbing variety of things. Now here's where it gets complicated. In most ecosystems, the top predator is pretty clearly defined. Lions in the savanna, wolves in the northern forests, sharks in the ocean. But in Guyana's wetlands, you have a situation that biologists politely call competitive overlap, and everyone else calls nature's cage match. Black caimans and giant anacondas occupy essentially the same ecological niche. They hunt the same prey. They live in the same waters, and unsurprisingly, they don't particularly like each other. The relationship between these two apex predators is one of mutual respect enforced by mutual danger. A large black caiman will absolutely eat a small or medium-sized anaconda if given the opportunity. The snake is just another source of protein after all, and caimans aren't known for their culinary preferences. But flip the script. Put a truly massive female anaconda in the water with a juvenile or mid-sized caiman, and suddenly the roles reverse. Anacondas have been documented killing and consuming caimans up to about 2 meters in length. It's a game of size and opportunity. Whoever's bigger wins. Welcome to the jungle, where the scoreboard is measured in kilograms, and the penalty for losing is becoming lunch. The indigenous peoples of this region understood this dynamic long before Western scientists showed up with their notebooks and measuring tapes. The Makushi people, who have lived in the Rupununi for centuries, have a name for the green anaconda that captures its status perfectly. They call it kamudi, and in their cosmology, it's not just a snake, it's a spirit of the water, a guardian of rivers and lagoons that commands respect bordering on reverence. Other indigenous groups throughout South America have similar concepts. In Quechua, the language of the Andean peoples, the anaconda is sometimes called Yakumama, literally mother of the water. This isn't some quaint folk belief. It's a recognition of ecological reality dressed in spiritual language. The anaconda doesn't just live in this ecosystem, it rules it. Santos explained this to the team one evening around the camp, as insects performed kamikaze dives into the lantern, and something large splashed in the darkness beyond the firelight. His grandfather, he said, had taught him to always acknowledge the kamudi when entering its territory. Not out of superstition, Santos was a practical man, but out of respect for what the animal represented. The anaconda was the jungle's way of keeping everything in balance. It took the old, the sick, the slow, the unlucky. It was a filter, a regulator, a force of natural selection made flesh. Or rather, made several 100 pounds of muscle wrapped in scales that could squeeze the life out of a deer. Victor found this perspective fascinating because it aligned perfectly with modern ecological theory. Apex predators are keystone species. Remove them, and the entire ecosystem wobbles. When wolves were eliminated from Yellowstone, deer populations exploded, which destroyed vegetation, which eroded riverbanks, which changed the actual course of rivers. The ecosystem literally reshaped itself in response to a missing predator. In Guyana, the anaconda plays a similar role. It keeps herbivore populations in check, which protects vegetation, which maintains water quality, which supports fish populations, which feeds the birds, which spreads seeds, which grows into trees, which provide habitat for monkeys, which become food for harpy eagles, and round the circle goes. Pull out the anaconda and nobody knows exactly what happens, but the smart money says it wouldn't be good. Understanding this ecosystem wasn't just academic exercise for the team, it was practical strategy. If you want to find anacondas, you go where their food is, and their food, as established, is pretty much everywhere, but especially concentrated around permanent water bodies during the dry season and transitional periods. The team began systematically surveying the lagoons and river channels within a few kilometers of their base camp, documenting not just snake sightings, but the entire web of life. They counted capybaras. They mapped caiman basking sites. They tracked the movements of wading birds, which often indicate productive hunting grounds. Every piece of data was a thread in the tapestry, and somewhere in that tapestry was the pattern that would lead them to their quarry. It was Elena who spotted the vultures first. Turkey vultures, to be precise, those red-headed scavengers that look like someone tried to cross a turkey with a Gothic nightmare and succeeded a bit too well. They were circling about 2 kilometers east of the camp, their lazy spirals unmistakable against the morning sky. Circling vultures mean one thing: something is dead. And in anaconda territory, dead things are worth investigating. The team loaded into the boat and headed upriver, following the direction of the birds. Santos navigated, reading the water with the casual expertise of someone who had been doing this since before he could walk. The channel narrowed, widened, split into smaller tributaries, rejoined. The vegetation closed in overhead, creating a green tunnel that smelled of mud and growth and decay. After about 40 minutes, they rounded a bend and found what the vultures had already discovered. The smell hit them first. If you've never experienced the odor of large-scale reptilian decomposition in tropical heat, consider yourself lucky. Imagine the worst fish market you've ever walked past. Multiply it by 10, Add a notes of swamp gas and old leather, and you're still not quite there. Marcus made a noise that might charitably be described as a gag, and less charitably described as the sound of a man questioning his career choices. Elena naturally seemed entirely unbothered and was already pulling on examination gloves. The dead anaconda lay on a muddy bank, half in and half out of the water. Vultures had already been at work, the eyes were gone, and portions of the softer tissue had been torn away. But the overall structure was remarkably intact. And it was big. Not record-breaking big, but definitely impressive. Victor estimated the length at somewhere around 5.5 meters, which is longer than most cars and significantly more dangerous. The diameter at the midsection was probably 30 centimeters, about the size of a dinner plate, which for a snake is basically bodybuilder territory. Eleanor was in her element. A dead anaconda might seem like a disappointing find. Nobody travels to Guyana to look at corpses after all. But for a scientist, a fresh specimen is a goldmine of information. She began a systematic examination, dictating observations into her voice recorder while Marcus filmed and Victor measured. The cause of death wasn't immediately apparent. No obvious wounds, no signs of disease, no indication of human involvement. Sometimes snakes just die. Old age, parasites, failed meals, the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. The jungle takes its toll on everything eventually. What the specimen revealed, though, was extraordinary. Eleanor counted the vertebrae, over 300 of them, each one connected to a pair of ribs that curved around the body like the framework of some organic submarine. Unlike mammals, which have a fixed number of ribs, snakes can have anywhere from a couple hundred to over 400 pairs depending on their length. Each rib is connected to muscles that allow the snake to move in that distinctive serpentine wave, and in anacondas, those muscles are preposterously powerful. Eleanor estimated that a snake of this size, alive and motivated, could exert a constricting force of several hundred pounds per square inch, more than enough to stop the heart of any prey animal and most unfortunate humans. The skull was particularly fascinating. Anaconda jaws are connected by elastic ligaments that allow them to stretch to truly absurd proportions. This is how they swallow prey much larger than their own head diameter. The jaw literally dislocates, the skin stretches, and the animal basically walks itself over the meal using alternating movements of the upper and lower jawbones. It's deeply unsettling to watch and absolutely remarkable from an engineering perspective. Elena pointed out the heat-sensing pits along the snake's lips, used to detect warm-blooded prey in total darkness. Even dead, in the midst of decomposition and vulture damage, the anaconda's evolutionary perfection was evident. But the most important discovery wasn't anatomical, it was contextual. As Elena examined the corpse, Santos walked the surrounding area, reading the landscape the way a detective reads a crime scene. He found tracks, multiple tracks. The belly prints of at least 3 other large anacondas crisscrossing the mud around the body, some of them fresher than others. Whatever had happened here, this dead snake hadn't been alone. The area was clearly a congregation point, a place where anacondas gathered, perhaps to feed on concentrated prey, perhaps for mating, perhaps for reasons that made sense only to the snakes themselves. Victor marked the coordinates on his GPS. This location went on the priority list immediately. Where there's one anaconda, there are usually more, and where there's a 5.5-meter specimen, there must be, something larger. The dead snake was a signpost pointing toward the living giants that still lurked in the dark water. The smell was unbearable, the heat was oppressive, and the mosquitoes were treating the team like an all-you-can-bite buffet. But nobody complained. They were getting closer. The corpse would continue to decompose, the vultures would finish their work, and the jungle would reclaim what had always belonged to it. But the data would remain: measurements, photographs, tissue samples for later analysis, coordinates for future expeditions. Science is built on such small victories, each one a brick in the wall of understanding. And somewhere out there, probably not far from where the dead snake lay rotting in the sun, something much bigger was very much alive. The discovery of the dead anaconda and its surrounding tracks opened a new phase of the expedition. But Victor knew that satellite imagery and thermal cameras could only take them so far. The real map of anaconda territory existed in a different form, in the memories and stories of the people who had lived alongside these creatures for generations. It was time to consult the true experts. Santos arranged a meeting with his uncle, a man named Domingo who had lived his entire 78 years in a small village on the banks of the Rupununi River. Domingo was what anthropologists call a knowledge keeper, and what everyone else calls the guy who knows everything about everything. His face was a topographical map of wrinkles, each line seemingly corresponding to a story, and his eyes held the sharp clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime watching and remembering. When the team arrived at his wooden house on stilts, he was sitting on the porch weaving a fishing net, his fingers moving with the automatic precision of decades of practice. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 4 hours and required multiple cups of extremely strong coffee that Elena later described as basically legal stimulants with attitude. Domingo spoke in a mixture of English, Portuguese, and Makushi, with Santos translating the parts that needed translating and the team nodding along to the parts that didn't. What emerged was not just information, it was oral history, a living archive of human-snake coexistence that stretched back further than any written record. Domingo's own encounter with a truly massive anaconda happened when he was 18 years old, which by his calculation placed it somewhere in the mid-1960s. His family kept cattle, a small herd of about 20 head that grazed the savannah near a permanent lagoon called a Curie Pool. One dry season, the cattle started disappearing. Not dying, not wandering off, not being taken by jaguars, disappearing. One day you'd have 20 cows, the next day you'd have 19, and there'd be no blood, no bones, no tracks, no sign of struggle, just one less cow. This happened 3 times in 2 weeks. Naturally, Domingo's father was losing his mind. Cattle represented wealth, security, the difference between eating well and going hungry. Something was taking them, and whatever it was needed to be stopped. So young Domingo and his older brother Manuel set out to solve the mystery. They tracked the cattle's movements, mapped their grazing patterns, and eventually identified the lagoon as the likely ambush point. The cattle came to drink at dawn and dusk, when the light was low and the water was still. Perfect conditions for something patient, something that could wait beneath the surface for hours without moving, something very, very large. The brothers decided to stake out the lagoon. They climbed a tree overlooking the water and waited through an entire night, armed with machetes and a single-shot rifle that was older than both of them combined. At dawn, they watched their remaining cattle approach the water's edge. And then they saw it. Domingo paused here in his telling, and his eyes went somewhere else for a moment, back to that morning 60 years ago when his understanding of the world fundamentally shifted. What he described was not a snake as most people imagine snakes. It was infrastructure. It was architecture. The animal was lying in the shallows, partially concealed by water hyacinths, and Domingo's first thought, his actual first conscious thought, was that someone had built a wall across the lagoon overnight. The dark, glistening mass stretched from one bank almost to the other, maybe 25 meters of continuous body. When his brain finally processed what he was seeing, when he understood that this wall could move, that it was alive, that it was watching his cattle with the same patient calculation that a diner shows when examining a menu, he experienced what he could only describe as religious terror. The brothers didn't shoot, they didn't move, they barely breathed. They watched as a cow wandered too close to the water, watched as the wall suddenly accelerated with impossible speed for something so massive, watched as coils thicker than a man's torso wrapped around the thrashing animal and dragged it beneath. The surface. The whole attack took maybe 15 seconds. The water churned brown and then went still. The remaining cattle scattered, bellowing in panic. And the brothers climbed down from their tree and walked home without speaking, because what words could possibly be adequate? Victor listened to this story with the carefully neutral expression of a scientist who doesn't want to show bias. 25 meters was roughly 80 feet, about 3 times the length of any anaconda ever scientifically verified. It was the stuff of cryptozoology, of monster hunting shows with dramatic music and night vision cameras that never quite capture anything definitive. And yet, Domingo was not a man given to exaggeration. His other estimates, the sizes of fish he'd caught, the distances he'd travelled, the yields of his crops, were all reasonable, verifiable, mundane. He had no apparent reason to lie and no obvious investment in impressing a bunch of outsiders with tall tales. Santos vouched for his uncle's honesty without hesitation. So what was the truth? Eleanor offered a possible explanation. Memory, she noted, is not a video recording. It's a reconstruction, assembled from sensory impressions and emotional responses and filled in with assumptions. An 18-year-old boy in a state of genuine terror, seeing an animal larger than anything he'd ever encountered, might honestly perceive it as bigger than it actually was. Fear distorts. Darkness distorts. Water distorts. The snake could have been 7 or 8 meters, which would be extraordinary enough, and memory, over 6 decades, could have stretched it to something mythological. This didn't make Domingo a liar. It made him human. But Domingo had more stories, and some of them weren't his own. He told of his grandfather, who had spoken of a time before cattle, before the Europeans, when the Makushi lived entirely off the land and water. In those days, the giant anacondas were treated as something between gods and natural disasters, forces to be respected, appeased, and avoided. There were taboos against killing them, against even speaking their names during certain seasons. Shamans claimed to communicate with them, to receive warnings of floods and droughts through dreams sent by the great serpents. Whether you believed in the spiritual dimension or not, these practices demonstrated an ecological awareness that Western science was only beginning to articulate. Then there was the legend of the lost travellers, which Santos had heard in different versions from villages throughout the region. The basic story went like this. A group of traders, the number varied from 3 to 7 depending on who told it, were travelling through the deep forest during the rainy season when they became lost. For 2 days they walked alongside what they thought was a rock formation, a long ridge of dark stone that emerged from the water and continued as far as they could see in either direction. They made camp beside it, grateful for the windbreak it provided. On the morning of the 3rd day the formation moved, the earth shook. The ridge lifted itself and revealed an eye the size of a dinner plate, and the traders realized they had been sleeping next to a snake so immense that their minds had refused to process it as an animal at all. Now Victor knew this was almost certainly folklore. The physics alone made a snake of that size, something that would need to be over 30 meters long, essentially impossible. Snakes are constrained by the square cube law. As length increases, volume increases faster, and at some point the animal simply can't support its own body weight or circulate blood effectively. The largest reliably measured anacondas are around 8 to 9 meters. Even the most generous estimates from credible sources don't exceed 12 meters. A 30-meter snake would need proportions that contradicted basic biology. And yet the same story, with minor variations, appeared in indigenous oral traditions across a geographical range spanning thousands of kilometers. From the Orinoco Basin to the Pantanal, from the Guyanese interior to the rivers of Bolivia, people told tales of anacondas so large they were mistaken for landscape features. Either there was some ancient cultural exchange that spread a single original myth across the entire continent, or multiple unconnected groups had independently experienced something that inspired similar stories. The skeptic in Victor dismissed the literal interpretation. The scientist in him filed it under interesting unexplained pattern and moved on. What Domingo and Santos could offer that was genuinely practical, though, was knowledge of snake behavior tied to seasonal cycles. This was information that no amount of academic study could replicate. The accumulated wisdom of generations who depended on understanding these patterns for their survival. And this brought the conversation to the critical factor that shaped everything in the Rupununi: water. The Rupununi savanna exists in a state of perpetual transformation, its character determined entirely by the ancient rhythm of wet and dry seasons. During the dry season, which typically runs from September to April, the region becomes something almost alien. The vast grasslands turn golden, then brown, then grey. Rivers shrink to trickles. Lagoons evaporate to mud. The air fills with smoke from wildfires that sweep across the landscape, some natural, some set deliberately by ranchers to clear old growth and stimulate new grass. These fires can travel for days, burning everything in their path, turning the savanna into an apocalyptic hellscape of ash and ember. Anacondas have adapted to this harsh reality with strategies that seem almost clever, though attributing intelligence to reptiles is always a bit anthropomorphic. As water sources shrink, the snakes concentrate around the remaining permanent pools and river channels. Competition increases. Smaller anacondas get pushed to marginal territories or simply don't survive. The largest individuals claim the best spots, the deepest pools, the coolest mudbanks, the areas with the most remaining prey. This concentration makes them theoretically easier to find, but also more dangerous. A stressed, hungry 6-meter anaconda in a shrinking pond is not an animal that appreciates visitors. Some anacondas take a different approach entirely. Instead of competing for diminishing resources, they essentially hibernate, a process called estivation. They bury themselves in mud, sometimes up to a meter deep, and enter a state of reduced metabolism where they can survive for months without food or water. Their heart rate slows, their digestion stops. They become, for all practical purposes, living mummies waiting for resurrection. When the rains finally return, they dig themselves out and resume normal operations, none the worse for their underground vacation. It's a remarkable adaptation, though it does make them essentially unfindable during the dry season, unless you're willing to dig up several thousand square kilometers of savanna on spec. Then the wet season arrives, and everything transforms again. The rains in Guyana aren't like rain in temperate climates, gentle, intermittent, manageable. This is tropical rain, delivered in quantities that seem to violate basic atmospheric physics. The sky opens up and doesn't close for hours, sometimes days. Rivers overflow their banks, the savanna floods turning from grassland into a shallow inland sea that can stretch to the horizon. Isolated ponds connect into vast networks. Fish explode in population, breeding frantically in the newly available habitat. Birds migrate in from across the continent to feast on the abundance. For anacondas, the wet season is paradise and prison combined. Food is everywhere, capybaras spreading out across the flooded landscape, fish in every channel, caimans fat from their own hunting success. But the snakes themselves disperse across the vast new water world, becoming needles in a haystack the size of New Jersey. Visibility drops to near zero in the sediment-laden water. Traditional tracking methods become almost useless. This is why most anaconda research happens during the transitional periods, late dry season when the snakes are concentrated but before they've estivated, or early wet season when the floods haven't yet made the landscape impossible. Victor's expedition had timed their arrival for exactly this window. The rains had started, but the full flooding hadn't occurred yet. Water levels were rising, which meant anacondas that had been hiding in estivation burrows or concentrated in core refugia were starting to move, to explore, to spread out into newly available territory. They were active. They were hungry. They were looking for mates, and for about 4 to 6 weeks they would be more visible and more findable than at any other time of year. Of course, more findable in anaconda terms still meant incredibly difficult to locate. The transitional period also brought its own special challenges. The weather was wildly unpredictable. Blazing sunshine one hour, torrential downpour the next, followed by muggy stillness that made the air feel like warm soup. The water levels changed daily, sometimes hourly. Channels that were navigable in the morning might be too shallow by afternoon, or flooded beyond safe passage by the next day. The team had to constantly adapt their plans, their routes, their expectations. And then there was the wildlife. Everything in the Rupununi was also taking advantage of the seasonal transition. Jaguar activity peaked as prey animals concentrated near remaining water. Caiman populations surged with breeding season aggression. The insects, good lord, the insects, achieved what could only be described as biblical proportions. Mosquitoes formed clouds thick enough to show up on radar. Biting flies descended in waves that made outdoor work a constant battle. Marcus documented it all, including several memorable minutes of footage that was just him cursing at the bugs before remembering the camera was rolling. But the team pressed on. Domingo's stories had given them something valuable. Specific locations, names of lagoons where the old people had encountered large snakes, descriptions of landscape features that hadn't changed in decades. The kind of local knowledge that no satellite or drone could provide. They had a map now, not printed on paper, but spoken in stories, drawn from memory, validated by generations of survival. Somewhere out there, in the rising waters and shifting channels and ancient forests, the giants were waiting. The hunt was about to enter a new phase. Armed with Domingo's stories and Santos's local expertise, the team set out for a lagoon called Karanambu, a name that Santos translated loosely as place of dark water, which, given everything they'd learned about this region, seemed both poetic and ominous. The journey took most of a morning, navigating channels that grew progressively narrower and murkier until the boat was essentially pushing through a tunnel of overhanging vegetation. Spiders the size of dinner plates watched from webs strung between branches. Snakes, small ones thankfully, draped themselves over limbs like living decorations. At one point, a troop of howler monkeys overhead began their territorial call, a sound that can only be described as what happens when you feed a lion through a distortion pedal. Marcus nearly fell out of the boat. Karanambu revealed itself gradually, the channel opening into a lagoon roughly the size of 2 football fields placed end to end. The water was the colour of strong black tea, tannic, opaque, and absolutely concealing whatever lurked beneath. Lily pads clustered along the edges. A dead tree, bleached white by sun and stripped of bark, rose from the centre of the lagoon like a skeletal monument. And scattered across the surface, basking on logs and mud banks and floating vegetation, were caimans. Lots of caimans. Victor counted at least 15 visible from the boat, ranging from juveniles barely a metre long to adults that looked like they could star in their own horror franchise. This was exactly the kind of habitat where anacondas and caimans intersected, and the team settled in to observe. They positioned the boat in the shade of an overhanging tree, cut the motor, and waited. Patience is not optional in wildlife research. It's the entire job description. You wait, and you watch, and you try not to think about how badly you need to use a bathroom that doesn't exist. And eventually, if you're lucky, the animals forget you're there and start behaving naturally. While they waited, Eleanor gave an impromptu lecture on the ecological relationship between the 2 apex predators of this ecosystem. It was, she explained, one of the most interesting competitive dynamics in the entire animal kingdom. Both anacondas and black caimans occupy the top of the food chain. Both are ambush predators that hunt from the water. Both eat essentially the same prey: capybaras, deer, large birds, fish, and yes, each other. This creates what ecologists call intra-guild predation, which is a fancy way of saying that sometimes your competitor is also your lunch. The relationship is entirely size-dependent, and this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. A large black caiman, say 4 meters or more, is essentially untouchable by anything in its environment, except possibly a jaguar having an exceptionally ambitious day. These animals are armoured tanks with teeth. Their bite force is among the strongest of any living animal, capable of crushing bone and shell with casual ease. Their skin is covered in bony plates called osteoderms that function as natural armour. They are, in every meaningful sense, dinosaurs that refuse to acknowledge the meteor. But anacondas have their own advantages. They don't need to bite, they constrict. Their method of killing is essentially cardiac arrest through sustained pressure, squeezing until the prey's heart can no longer pump blood. And here's the key detail: constrictors can handle prey that fighters cannot. A caiman's armour and bite force mean nothing when you can't breathe. If an anaconda can get coils around a caiman before the caiman can bite, the snake wins. Period. The caiman's weapons become irrelevant. It's like bringing a gun to a wrestling match where the rules say you can't use your hands. So the dynamic becomes a calculation of relative size and opportunity. Adult black caimans will absolutely eat juvenile and medium-sized anacondas whenever they get the chance. The snake is just protein after all, and caimans don't have dietary preferences beyond fits in mouth, and not poisonous. Victor had seen photographs of caiman stomach contents that included anacondas up to 2 meters long, still a substantial snake, but apparently not substantial enough. On the flip side, large female anacondas, the biggest individuals in the species, have been documented killing and consuming caimans up to about 2.5 meters. There are even credible reports, complete with photographs, of truly massive anacondas tackling caimans over 3 meters, though these encounters probably represent exceptional circumstances rather than routine hunting. The result is a kind of mutual respect enforced by mutual danger. Neither species hunts the other as a primary food source. The risks are too high, the potential costs too severe. A caiman that attacks an anaconda might win, or might find itself wrapped in coils that even its powerful jaws can't escape. An anaconda that targets a caiman might succeed, or might lose chunks of its body to those crushing teeth before it can secure a killing grip. So mostly they coexist. They share territory. They eye each other warily across the water. They are neighbours who both know they could probably take the other in a fight but aren't quite certain enough to find out. The team observed this coexistence playing out in real time at Karanambu. The caimans basked in the sun, occasionally slipping into the water to cool off or reposition, then hauling themselves back onto their logs with the lethargic satisfaction of retirees at a Florida pool. Somewhere beneath the surface, invisible but certainly present, anacondas were doing whatever anacondas do during the day, digesting, resting, waiting for the cooler hours when they would become active hunters. Two apex predators sharing the same water, maintaining an uneasy peace that could shatter in an instant. It was Santos who spotted the snake first. He didn't say anything. He never did when he saw something interesting. He just went very still and pointed with his chin toward a patch of water hyacinth about 30 meters from the boat. At first, Victor couldn't see anything. Then he did. A head, barely visible among the floating vegetation, with nostrils and eyes breaking the surface in that characteristic anaconda posture. Based on the head size, Elena estimated the snake at around 3 to 3.5 meters, a respectable individual but not a giant, probably a young adult, possibly a male based on the relatively modest proportions. The snake was moving slowly through the hyacinths, using the vegetation as cover while it navigated the lagoon. Its destination wasn't clear, but its path was taking it directly toward a mudbank where a medium-sized caiman, maybe 2 meters, was sunning itself with the oblivious contentment of something that considers itself untouchable. Victor felt his pulse quicken. They might be about to witness something extraordinary. Marcus had the camera rolling, capturing everything in high definition. The distance was too great for close-up footage, but the zoom lens could make out details. The snake's tongue flicking to taste the air, the slow undulation of its body through the water, the caiman lying motionless on the mud with its eyes closed in. Apparent reptilian bliss. The whole scene had the quality of a nature documentary climax, the kind of moment that producers dream about and camera operators spend months trying to capture. The anaconda kept approaching, 20 meters from the caiman, 15, 10. It was moving so slowly that the water barely rippled, a masterclass in stealth from an animal that has been perfecting its hunting technique for millions of years. Victor found himself holding his breath. Elena was gripping the side of the boat so hard her knuckles had gone white. Even Santos, who had seen everything this landscape had to offer, was watching with unusual intensity. And then everything happened at once. The caiman's eyes snapped open. Whether it heard something, felt a vibration, or simply had the instinct that comes from being both predator and prey in a dangerous world, it suddenly became aware of the approaching threat. Its head swung toward the anaconda with terrifying speed. The snake froze. For about 2 seconds, though it felt much longer, the two reptiles stared at each other across 8 meters of shallow water. Predator evaluating predator. Calculator against calculator. Each one running the math on whether this encounter was worth the risk. Then the anaconda made its decision. It turned, not retreating exactly but redirecting, and began moving away from the caiman at a noticeably faster pace than before. The caiman watched it go, jaws slightly parted in what might have been a threat display or might have been reptilian contempt. It was hard to tell. After a moment, apparently satisfied that the danger had passed, the caiman settled back onto the mud and closed its eyes again. Just another day in the Rupununi. The team collectively exhaled. What they had witnessed wasn't the dramatic battle that would make viral YouTube clips. No coils wrapping around armoured bodies, no thrashing in bloody water, no clear winner emerging from an epic struggle. But in some ways, it was more interesting than a fight would have been. They had seen the calculation. They had watched two apex predators size each other up, run the risk-reward analysis, and decide that discretion was the better part of valor. This was how nature actually worked most of the time. Not constant warfare, but negotiated coexistence punctuated by occasional violence. Victor theorized afterward that the anaconda had been hoping to catch the caiman unaware, perhaps while it slept. A surprise attack from behind or below might have succeeded. The snake could have secured coils before the caiman could respond. But once the caiman was alert and facing the threat, the equation changed entirely. That 2-meter caiman was big enough to seriously injure or kill a 3-meter anaconda in a fair fight. And the anaconda apparently was smart enough to know it. What made this encounter even more interesting was what it implied about the larger ecosystem. The anaconda had been hunting, or at least exploring the possibility of hunting, the caiman. Not because capybaras weren't available, or fish were scarce, or it was desperate, but because caimans were there, and anacondas are opportunists. The dynamic between these two species wasn't just coexistence, it was active, ongoing competition. Every day in lagoons across the Rupununi, similar encounters were playing out. Most ended like this one, with mutual withdrawal, but some didn't. Some ended with a caiman's crushed body being slowly swallowed. Others ended with an anaconda's torn flesh sinking to the bottom. The peace was real, but it was also fragile. The team spent the rest of the afternoon at Karanambu, documenting the caiman population and watching for more snake activity. They spotted 2 more anacondas, both smaller than the first, both moving with the careful deliberation of animals that knew they weren't the biggest things in the water. Each time a snake's path brought it near a caiman, there was a visible adjustment, a subtle course correction that maintained distance without appearing to flee. It was like watching rush hour traffic, if the cars could eat each other. As the sun began to drop toward the horizon, turning the black water to bronze and gold, Victor made some notes in his field journal. The relationship between anacondas and caimans, he wrote, was a perfect illustration of how complex ecosystems actually function. There wasn't a simple predator-prey relationship here. There wasn't a clear hierarchy. There was a dynamic, shifting web of interactions where size and opportunity and individual boldness determined outcomes. Today's hunter could be tomorrow's meal. The rules were written in muscle and scale and prehistoric instinct, enforced by the simple mathematics of survival. Santos started the boat motor, and the noise sent every caiman in the lagoon sliding into the water with remarkable speed, for animals that had appeared half comatose moments before. Within seconds, the surface was empty, just brown water and lily pads and that bleached dead tree standing sentinel. But beneath the surface, the ancient competition continued, as it had for millions of years, as it would for millions more if humans didn't manage to destroy everything first. The team headed back toward camp, navigating by the last light of day and the first stars appearing overhead. They had come to Karanambu looking for giant anacondas and had found something equally valuable, a deeper understanding of the world those giants inhabited. In the Rupununi, everything was connected. Predator and prey, snake and caiman, water and land, all of it woven together into a tapestry that made the individual threads impossible to separate. To find the giants, you had to understand the tapestry, and today they had learned another thread. Tomorrow they would push deeper into anaconda territory. But tonight, there was dinner to cook, data to review, and the sounds of the jungle to fall asleep to, including, somewhere in the darkness, the splash of something very large entering the water. The encounter at Karanambu had whetted the team's appetite for more. They had seen the ecosystem in action, witnessed the tense detente between apex predators, and documented behavior that most researchers only read about in journals. But Victor wanted something more, something truly rare. And on day 12 of the expedition, through a combination of luck, skill, and what Santos would later describe as the jungle deciding to show off, they got it. The morning started like any other. Coffee that could dissolve spoons, mosquitoes treating everyone as breakfast, and a debate about which lagoon to survey next. Santos had been talking to fishermen from a nearby village, gathering intelligence the old-fashioned way, through conversation, observation, and the occasional exchange of supplies for information. One fisherman mentioned that he'd seen an unusually large female anaconda near a place called Turtle Pond, and more importantly, that she'd looked fat in the wrong way. Santos knew exactly what that meant. Female anacondas that are about to give birth have a distinctive appearance. Their bodies swell not uniformly, like a snake that's recently eaten, but in a particular way, bulging in the posterior third of their length where the developing young are carried. An experienced observer can tell the difference between a well-fed snake and a pregnant one, and the fisherman's description suggested the latter. If he was right, and if the team could find her, they might witness something that very few humans have ever seen in the wild, an anaconda giving birth. Getting to Turtle Pond required navigating a series of channels so narrow that at several points Santos had to get out of the boat and physically push it over sandbars. The vegetation closed in overhead, creating a green tunnel that blocked out most of the sky. Spiderwebs the size of tennis rackets stretched between branches, their occupants watching with the patient malevolence of creatures that know they're too small to eat you, but would definitely try if the size ratio were different. Marcus got a web to the face at one point and spent the next 10 minutes convinced he had a spider in his hair. He didn't, but the paranoia was understandable. Turtle Pond itself was modest, maybe 50 meters across, roughly circular with muddy banks and a carpet of floating vegetation that covered about a third of the surface. The name came from the mata-mata turtles that inhabited the area, bizarre-looking creatures with flat, leaf-shaped heads and necks covered in fleshy protuberances that made them look like something from a fever dream. They were harmless, though deeply unsettling to look at, like nature had decided to design a turtle while heavily medicated. The team deployed the underwater ROV first, sending the little robot on a survey of the pond's murky depths. Visibility was maybe half a metre on a good day, which meant the camera mostly showed brown water interrupted occasionally by glimpses of submerged logs, turtle shells, and once, memorably, a fish that seemed personally offended by the intrusion. After about 20 minutes of submarine reconnaissance that yielded nothing exciting, Victor made the call to switch to visual survey from the boat. They found her almost immediately. The female anaconda was resting in the shallows on the far side of the pond, her body partially concealed by water hyacinths, but visible enough for Elena to make an assessment. And what an assessment it was. Based on the visible portions, she estimated the snake at somewhere between 6 and 7 meters, a genuinely large individual, one of the biggest they'd encountered so far. But it was her shape that confirmed the fisherman's report. The posterior section of her body was distinctly swollen, bulging with the unmistakable cargo of developing young. She was pregnant, very pregnant, and based on the degree of distension, Elena guessed she was close to term. What followed was one of the most extraordinary days of Victor's career, and he had spent decades in the field watching extraordinary things. The team positioned their boat at what they hoped was a respectful distance, far enough not to disturb the snake, close enough for Marcus's telephoto lens to capture detail. Then they settled in to wait, and wait, and wait some more. Wildlife observation is roughly 95% patience and 5% frantically trying to document something that's happening faster than you can react. This day would prove the point spectacularly. Let me give you some background on anaconda reproduction, because it's genuinely one of the most fascinating aspects of these animals' biology. Anacondas are ovoviviparous, which is a $10 word that means they give birth to live young, but those young develop inside eggs that are retained within the mother's body. It's sort of a halfway house between egg-laying and true live birth. The babies hatch from their eggs internally and are then born as fully formed independent snakes. No nursing, no nest building, no parental care of any kind. Just congratulations on existing, now figure it out yourself. The gestation period for green anacondas is approximately 7 months, during which the female essentially becomes a mobile incubator. She carries anywhere from 20 to 80 developing embryos. The number varies based on her size, health, and nutritional status, and during this entire period, she typically doesn't eat, at all, for 7 months. Imagine being pregnant with octuplets and deciding that food just wasn't going to be part of your lifestyle until delivery. The metabolic demands are staggering. Females routinely lose 20 to 30% of their body weight during pregnancy, burning through fat reserves and even muscle tissue to fuel the development of the next generation. This is why large females are so crucial to anaconda populations. A small female might produce a dozen offspring. A truly massive female, 8 meters or more, could potentially give birth to over 80 babies in a single litter. The math is stark. Big snakes make more snakes. Protecting the largest individuals isn't just about preserving impressive specimens, it's about maintaining the reproductive capacity of the entire population. Every giant female is a biological factory, and every one that gets killed by hunters, by habitat destruction, by the simple bad luck of living in a dangerous world, represents dozens of potential offspring that will never exist. The female at Turtle Pond had clearly been through the ringer. Even from a distance, Victor could see that she looked depleted. Her body, while still massive, had a slightly deflated quality behind the swelling of pregnancy, the look of an animal that had been running on empty for months. Her scales, which should have gleamed with health, were dull. Her movements, when she moved at all, were sluggish. She was exhausted, probably hungry beyond what any of them could imagine, and entirely focused on the biological imperative playing out inside her body. Around midday, she began to shift position. It was subtle at first, just a slow repositioning of coils, a slight change in her orientation toward the bank. But Elena recognized the signs immediately. "She's getting ready," she whispered, as if the snake could hear them from 50 meters away. This is it. What happened over the next several hours was simultaneously beautiful and brutal, a reminder that nature operates without sentiment or softness. The female moved into shallower water, positioning herself where the mud met the vegetation, and began the process of expelling the young she had carried for 7 months. There was no drama, no obvious struggle, just slow, rhythmic contractions that produced one by one small bundles of writhing life. Each baby anaconda emerged wrapped in a thin membrane, the remnant of the egg it had developed in, and trailing an umbilical cord that connected it to the yolk sac that had sustained it during gestation. The newborns were remarkably large for baby snakes, averaging around 70 to 90 centimeters in length and roughly as thick as an adult human thumb. They were also remarkably vulnerable. Their first challenge in life, literally within seconds of being born, was to break free from the membrane and sever the umbilical connection. The ones that couldn't manage this, that got tangled or stuck or simply weren't strong enough, would drown or suffocate before they ever took their first independent breath. The team watched in fascinated horror as the birth progressed. Some of the babies broke free immediately, thrashing with surprising vigor until the membrane tore and they could swim away. Others struggled longer, fighting against the slippery tissue with what looked like genuine desperation, and some didn't make it. Victor counted at least 3 stillbirths among the babies delivered during the hours they observed. Small, motionless bundles that sank to the bottom without ever moving. Natural attrition. The cost of doing biological business. The mother, meanwhile, paid absolutely no attention to her offspring. This wasn't callousness. Anacondas simply don't have parental instincts. The babies weren't recognized as family or even as anything relevant. They were just objects that had exited her body. Once she'd finished delivering, she would rest, recover, and eventually go hunting to replenish the reserves she'd burned through. The babies would scatter into the vegetation, each one beginning an independent existence that would likely be brief and violent. The survival statistics for newborn anacondas are sobering. Of a typical litter of 40 babies, perhaps 5 or 6 will live to reach adulthood. The rest will be eaten by caimans, by large fish, by birds, by adult anacondas who have no concept of cannibalism as a moral issue and see small snakes as just another protein source. The jungle is not a nursery. It's a testing ground where the weak are culled with brutal efficiency, and only the lucky, the strong and the clever make it through. By late afternoon, the birth seemed to be winding down. Victor had counted approximately 55 live births, and probably more had occurred before they arrived, or in positions they couldn't observe clearly. The female had stopped contracting, her body now noticeably deflated, the pregnancy bulge replaced by loose folds of skin that would fill back out once she started eating again. She lay motionless in the shallows, apparently resting, while around her the surviving babies dispersed into the hyacinths like a graduating class scattering after the ceremony. Eleanor was practically vibrating with excitement, though she was trying to maintain professional composure. Documented wild births of green anacondas were vanishingly rare. Most of what science knew about anaconda reproduction came from captive animals or pieced-together observations from multiple incomplete encounters. What they had recorded today was genuinely significant, the kind of footage that would be analysed, cited, and built upon by researchers for years to come. Marcus had captured the whole thing in high definition, including close-up shots of individual births that showed details never before filmed in the wild. But for Victor, the most powerful moment wasn't the scientific significance. It was watching those newborn snakes, tiny by anaconda standards but already larger than many adult snakes of other species, fighting their way free of their membranes and swimming off into a world that was almost certainly going to kill most of them. There was no drama, no mother watching proudly, no sense of occasion. Just the cold equation of survival playing out in a muddy pond in the middle of nowhere. Those babies that made it through the next few months would face a gauntlet of predators, parasites, diseases, and simple bad luck. They would need to find food, avoid becoming food, survive the dry season and the wet season and everything in between. The handful that beat all those odds would grow, slowly at first, then faster as they entered their juvenile years. In a decade, the lucky ones might reach 3 or 4 meters. In 2 decades, the exceptional ones might approach the size of their mother. And in 3 or 4 decades, if everything went impossibly right, one of them might become the kind of giant that inspired legends. The team departed Turtle Pond as the light began to fade, leaving the exhausted mother to her recovery and the scattered babies to their fates. Santos navigated by memory and instinct, threading through the channels as the first stars appeared overhead. Nobody spoke much. The day had been too significant, too primal, too much a reminder of the raw mechanics underlying all life. Birth and death, struggle and survival, the ancient cycle repeating itself in a corner of the world that most humans would never see. Somewhere back at Turtle Pond, a female anaconda who had given everything to produce the next generation was resting in the shallows, her body depleted but alive. And somewhere in the surrounding vegetation, 50-odd baby snakes were beginning the long, dangerous journey toward adulthood. Most would fail, some would survive. And the species would continue, as it had for millions of years, indifferent to human observation and human sentiment alike. The circle of life, the team realized, wasn't a Disney song. It was a meat grinder with scales. The birth at Turtle Pond had given the team something rare and scientifically valuable. But Victor wasn't satisfied. He never was. They had documented behavior, observed the ecosystem, witnessed reproduction. What they hadn't done yet was get truly close to a large adult anaconda in its element, and for that they needed to change their approach entirely. Anacondas, it turns out, are largely nocturnal. The daytime observations had been useful, but to really understand these animals, the team needed to enter their world on their terms. That meant hunting in the dark. Now, hunting is perhaps the wrong word. Nobody was planning to catch, harm, or even touch any anacondas. The goal was purely observational, to find, film, and study these animals during their active hours without disturbing their natural behavior. But doing wildlife research at night in the Rupununi is a bit like playing a video game on nightmare difficulty while blindfolded. Everything that makes the jungle challenging during the day becomes exponentially worse after sunset. The heat doesn't go away, it just gets humid instead of scorching. The insects don't sleep, they actually become more aggressive. And the things that want to eat you? Yeah, those are mostly nocturnal too. Fun times. The team's secret weapon for nighttime operations was thermal imaging technology. Infrared cameras detect heat radiation rather than visible light, which means they can see warm objects in complete darkness. On a thermal display, warm things show up as bright yellows, oranges, and reds, while cool things appear blue or purple. The human body, at a toasty 37 degrees Celsius, lights up like a Christmas tree. A caiman, slightly cooler than a mammal but warmer than the surrounding water, shows as a distinct orange shape. And an anaconda, well, that's where things get interesting. Snakes are ectothermic, meaning their body temperature is largely determined by their environment. During the day, an anaconda basking in the sun might be nearly as warm as a mammal. But at night, as the ambient temperature drops, so does the snake's body heat. This creates a thermal signature that's different from warm-blooded prey, a subtle gradient rather than a bright hotspot. The team's cameras were sensitive enough to detect this, at least in theory. In practice, telling the difference between a snake and a warm log required experience, patience, and a fair amount of squinting at grainy green displays, while mosquitoes attempted to drain your entire blood supply. Eleanor had proposed an experiment that walked the line between brilliant and slightly insane. Anacondas, she explained, have their own thermal sensors, specialized organs called pit organs located around their mouths that can detect infrared radiation from warm-blooded prey. This is how they hunt in total darkness, sensing the heat signature of a capybara or deer and striking with precision even when they can't see their target. But here's the thing, pit organs only detect living heat. A warm rock doesn't trigger a hunting response because it doesn't move, doesn't breathe, doesn't have the specific heat pattern of something alive. Which raised an interesting question. What if you created a fake heat source that mimicked a living animal? The result of Elena's brainstorm was possibly the strangest piece of equipment the expedition had produced, a robotic decoy. Victor and Marcus spent an entire afternoon constructing it from materials they'd brought and things they'd improvised. The base was a small remote-controlled platform, similar to what hobbyists use for RC cars but modified for rough terrain. Mounted on top was a heating element, basically a modified hand warmer connected to a battery pack, wrapped in fabric and shaped into a vaguely animal-like form. Elena contributed the finishing touch, a toy monkey she'd inexplicably packed just in case. Don't ask why a herpetologist travels with a stuffed monkey. Some questions are better left unasked. The monkey was positioned on the heating element and wrapped in an insulating layer that would keep the warm body, but leave the extremities cooler, mimicking the thermal profile of an actual animal. The result looked absolutely ridiculous, like something a particularly imaginative child might create during a fever dream. But on thermal imaging, it showed up as a surprisingly convincing blob of mammalian heat. If the theory was correct, an anaconda's pit organs would detect this signature and potentially investigate, allowing the team to observe hunting behavior up close without risking any actual animals. If the theory was wrong, they'd just spent 4 hours building the world's most elaborate snakebait for nothing. They deployed the decoy at a small lagoon about a kilometre from the main camp, a spot Santos had identified as likely anaconda territory based on the abundance of prey tracks around its edges. The plan was simple: position the warm monkey on the bank near the water's edge, retreat to a safe observation distance, and wait with thermal cameras ready. Night fell with the abruptness typical of the tropics. One moment golden sunset, the next moment utter darkness, and the experiment began. The first 2 hours were uneventful, which is to say they were filled with discomfort, boredom, and the growing suspicion that this whole plan was stupid. The thermal cameras showed the usual nighttime activity: a family of capybaras grazing on the far shore, their bodies glowing warmly in the display, a caiman cruising slowly through the shallows, its cooler form creating a distinctive silhouette, various birds and rodents going about their nocturnal business, oblivious to the humans watching from the darkness. The monkey decoy sat on the bank, dutifully radiating its fake heat signature, looking progressively more absurd as time went on. Then, around 11 p.m, something changed. Marcus spotted it first: a different kind of movement in the water, slower and more deliberate than the caiman patrols they'd been tracking. He pointed it out on his thermal display, and Victor's stomach did a small flip as he recognized the shape. It was an anaconda, probably 3 to 4 meters based on the proportions, and it was heading directly toward the bank where the decoy was positioned. The snake moved with the unhurried confidence of an apex predator, its body creating subtle ripples that registered on the thermal camera as cooler water mixing with warmer. The team held their breath. The anaconda approached the bank, its head emerging from the water maybe 5 meters from the decoy. On the thermal display they could see the heat pits flanking its mouth, slightly warmer spots where the infrared sensors were actively detecting the environment. The snake's tongue flicked out, tasting the air, gathering chemical information to complement its thermal picture. For several long seconds it remained motionless, apparently assessing the strange warm thing sitting on the bank. And then, to everyone's astonishment, it began to approach. The snake moved out of the water onto the mud, its powerful body flowing with the liquid grace that makes constrictors so mesmerizing and so terrifying. It wasn't rushing. Anacondas rarely do, but its trajectory was unmistakable. It was heading for the decoy. The heat signature had worked. The monkey, ridiculous as it looked, had fooled an animal that had been hunting with thermal sensors for millions of years. Victor felt a surge of scientific triumph mixed with genuine nervousness about what would happen when the snake reached its target and discovered it had been bamboozled by a toy. The anaconda was about 2 meters from the decoy when everything went sideways. A splash erupted from the water behind it, violent, sudden, and accompanied by the distinctive sound of jaws snapping shut. A caiman, apparently drawn by either the commotion or the heat signature, or just pure opportunistic hunger, had launched itself from the lagoon and nearly caught the anaconda's tail. The snake reacted with explosive speed, whipping around and retreating toward the water while the caiman thrashed in confusion, having missed its target by inches. For a moment, chaos reigned. The thermal display became a blur of hot and cool shapes colliding, separating, circling. The anaconda reached the water and disappeared beneath the surface. The caiman, apparently satisfied that it had defended its territory, or confused about what it had been attacking in the first place, retreated to its previous position. And the monkey decoy sat on the bank, still radiating its fake heat, completely undisturbed by the violence that had nearly occurred beside it. Nature had once again demonstrated its absolute indifference to human plans. The team reviewed the footage later that night, huddled around a laptop in the glow of headlamps while moths committed suicide against the screen. What they had captured was genuinely remarkable. Clear thermal imagery of an anaconda responding to an artificial heat stimulus, approaching potential prey with observable hunting behavior. The caiman interruption was actually a bonus, providing footage of interspecies interaction that complemented their earlier observations at Karanambu. The experiment, despite its chaotic conclusion, had been a success. Buoyed by this victory, Victor decided to push for the expedition's primary objective, finding the legendary large anacondas that Domingo had described. The stories all pointed to one location, a remote lagoon that the Makushi called Wara Wara, which Santos translated as mirror water for its stillness in the early morning. According to local accounts, this was where the truly massive specimens lived, the old females who had survived decades and grown to sizes that approached the limits of anaconda biology. If giants existed anywhere in the Rupununi, they would be there. Reaching Wara Wara required a full day of travel through increasingly difficult terrain. The final approach was impossible by boat. The channels had narrowed to the point where even Santos couldn't navigate them, so the team proceeded on foot, wading through knee-deep water and pushing through vegetation that seemed determined to stop them. The insects were beyond oppressive. The heat was a physical weight. By the time they reached a vantage point overlooking the lagoon, everyone was exhausted, soaked, and questioning their life choices at a fundamental level. But the view was worth it. Wara Wara was larger than expected, maybe 200 meters across, kidney-shaped, surrounded by dense forest that leaned over the water like curious spectators. The surface was indeed mirror-still, broken only by the occasional emergence of a turtle or the ripple of a fish, and there, visible even from a distance, were shapes that made Victor's pulse quicken. Dark, serpentine forms basking on logs and mudbanks, multiple large anacondas gathered in one place, exactly as the legends had promised. This was where the drone came in. The team's remaining aerial unit, their backup after the first had been sacrificed to the jungle earlier in the expedition, was their best chance to survey the lagoon without disturbing its inhabitants. From 100 meters up, they could assess the snake population, estimate sizes, identify individuals, and plan their approach for closer observation. It was the smart play, the professional play, the play that any experienced researcher would make. Marcus launched the drone with practiced efficiency. The little quadcopter rose smoothly, its camera transmitting clear images to the tablet he cradled in his hands. The lagoon spread out below, its secrets becoming visible from the air. 1 anaconda, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were at least 8 large snakes visible, scattered around the lagoon's edges like decorations at the world's most terrifying pool party. And they were big. Even from altitude, Victor could tell these weren't the 3 and 4 meter specimens they'd been encountering. These were something else entirely. "That one," Elena said, pointing at the screen. "Lower right. Can you get a size estimate?" Marcus maneuvered the drone closer, the camera zooming in on a female basking on a mudflat. She was enormous. Her body stretched across the mud like a living pipeline, coil after coil of dark green muscle catching the afternoon sun. Victor did mental calculations based on the known dimensions of the objects around her. Logs, vegetation, the mudflat itself. 5 meters, 5.5, maybe 6. This was a genuinely large animal, the kind of specimen that serious researchers devoted careers to studying. And then the drone found something bigger. Near the center of the lagoon, partially submerged in the shallows, was a shape that made even Santos, who had seen everything, inhale sharply. The snake was resting with only her head and the first meter of her body visible, the rest hidden beneath the dark water. But what was visible suggested dimensions that approached the legendary. Based on the head size and anaconda head scale proportionally with body length, Elena estimated they were looking at something between 7 and 8 meters. A true giant. The kind of snake that inspired stories of walls that turned out to be bodies, of rivers that were actually serpents, of the ancient power that ruled these waters. Victor was composing his approach plan when the tablet flickered. The drone's video feed stuttered, pixelated, and went black. For a moment, everyone thought it was just interference. Atmospheric conditions in the tropics could do strange things to radio signals. But when the feed came back, the image was tilted wildly, the lagoon spinning in the frame like a carnival ride. Marcus's fingers flew over the controls, trying to stabilize, trying to regain control. Nothing responded. The drone was in freefall. They heard the splash from 100 meters away. The tablet showed one final image before the feed died completely. Brown water rushing up to meet the camera, then darkness. The GPS signal, which had been broadcasting the drone's position to the backup receiver, showed it sitting motionless in the center of Wara Wara Lagoon, in water. in the same water where at least 8 large anacondas and who knew how many caimans were currently lounging. The equipment wasn't just lost, it was unrecoverable. The team stood in stunned silence. Thousands of dollars of technology, their best survey tool, their eye in the sky, gone. Marcus checked and rechecked the systems, hoping for some explanation, some fix, some miracle. The battery readout showed 30% remaining charge when connection was lost. The motors had been functioning normally. The GPS had been locked on. There was no obvious reason for the failure. The jungle had simply decided to take something, and it had taken it. Santos, surprisingly, was the one who broke the silence. Wara Wara doesn't like being watched from above, he said, and it was impossible to tell if he was joking. The loss of the drone forced a tactical retreat. Without aerial surveillance, approaching the lagoon on foot became exponentially more dangerous. They'd be entering territory occupied by multiple large predators, with no advance warning of their positions or behavior. Victor made the call to withdraw, regroup, and plan a careful ground approach for the following day. It was the right decision, but it tasted like defeat. That night, reviewing the final images captured before the crash, the team found themselves staring at the frozen frame of that giant female in the shallows. 7 meters, maybe 8. A snake older than some of them, a survivor of decades of droughts and floods and predators and diseases. She was still out there, in that still water, waiting. And tomorrow, one way or another, they were going to try to meet her properly. The jungle had won this round, but the expedition wasn't over yet. The morning after losing the drone, the team woke to a sky that couldn't decide between rain and sunshine, a meteorological coin flip that perfectly matched their mood. The loss of aerial surveillance meant they'd be entering Wara Wara essentially blind, relying on ground-level observation in territory occupied by animals that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of not being seen until it was too late. Victor gathered everyone for a strategy session that was equal parts planning meeting and pep talk. The approach would be careful, methodical, and above all, slow. Santos would lead, reading the terrain the way a chess master reads a board. Eleanor would follow with the underwater ROV, their last piece of functional high-tech equipment, hoping to survey the lagoon's depths before anyone got in the water. Victor and Marcus would handle visual documentation from whatever safe vantage points they could establish. The goal was simple: find the giant female they'd spotted from the drone, observe her behavior, and if possible, get close enough for accurate measurements. Simple goals, naturally, have a way of becoming complicated. The trek to Wara Wara took longer than expected. Overnight rain had raised water levels throughout the channel system, turning yesterday's path into today's obstacle course. What had been ankle-deep wading became waist-deep swimming in places. Equipment bags had to be held overhead. Footing was treacherous. Hidden roots and submerged logs conspired to dump anyone who got careless. By the time the team reached the lagoon's edge, they looked less like a professional research expedition and more like the losing team in a very aggressive game show involving mud. The lagoon was still, unnervingly still. The mirror water that gave Wara Wara its name was living up to its reputation, the surface reflecting the sky so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where air ended and water began. The anacondas they'd spotted from the drone were nowhere visible, not surprising given that the disturbance of their approach had probably sent every animal in the area into hiding. Patience would be required. Patience, and the hope that the snakes would eventually decide the strange bipedal intruders weren't worth worrying about. Eleanor deployed the ROV from a shallow inlet on the lagoon's southern edge. The little robot slipped beneath the surface and immediately began transmitting footage to the tablet Marcus held, showing the underwater world that humans could only glimpse from above. The visibility was better than expected, maybe 2 meters in the tannin-stained water, and the camera revealed a landscape of submerged logs, root systems, and aquatic vegetation that created a 3-dimensional maze beneath the still surface. Fish darted past the lens. A turtle the size of a serving platter drifted by with the unhurried dignity of something that knows nothing wants to eat it. And everywhere, shadows that might be logs or might be something else entirely. The ROV moved slowly through the underwater terrain, Elena guiding it with careful inputs while the rest of the team watched the feed over Marcus's shoulder. They spotted several anacondas almost immediately, smaller individuals 2 to 3 meters, resting among the roots and vegetation. One was actively hunting, its body coiled in an S shape as it tracked something the camera couldn't quite see. The footage was remarkable, intimate glimpses into a world that few humans ever witness, but it wasn't what they were looking for. They needed the giants. Eleanor guided the ROV deeper into the lagoon, toward the area where they'd spotted the massive female from the drone. The terrain became more complex, denser vegetation, more debris, less clear water. The robot's lights created cones of illumination in the murk, revealing brief glimpses of the alien landscape before the darkness swallowed them again. It felt like exploring another planet, which in a sense it was, a planet where humans were neither wanted nor particularly safe. The ROV was about 50 meters from shore when it found trouble. The camera showed a wall of reeds ahead, thick and tangled, blocking the planned route. Eleanor tried to navigate around, but the vegetation seemed to extend in all directions. She attempted to push through, hoping the small robot could squeeze between the stems. It couldn't. The ROV lurched, stuttered, and stopped. On the tablet screen, the image showed nothing but green, reeds pressed against the lens from all sides. The robot was stuck. What happened next would become the defining moment of the entire expedition. Eleanor made the decision almost instantly. The ROV represented their last piece of advanced equipment, and leaving it tangled in the reeds wasn't an option. She was going in to retrieve it manually. Victor started to object, pointing out the obvious dangers. They were in water known to contain multiple large anacondas, visibility was poor, and the whole plan felt like the setup for a horror movie. Elena acknowledged all of this with a nod that suggested she'd already considered and dismissed these concerns, then began wading into the lagoon before anyone could mount a more persuasive argument. The water reached her waist, then her chest, then her shoulders as she moved toward where the GPS locator showed the ROV's position. The bottom was soft mud that sucked at her feet with each step. The temperature was surprisingly warm, almost bathwater-like, which would have been pleasant under different circumstances. Through her mask, she'd brought a basic snorkeling setup for exactly this kind of situation. She could see maybe a meter ahead, the brown water reducing everything beyond that distance to vague shadows and suggestions. She found the ROV tangled in the reeds about 2 meters below the surface. The retrieval itself was straightforward. A few minutes of careful untangling, some creative maneuvering, and the little robot was free. She tucked it under her arm and began the swim back to shore, moving slowly to avoid disturbing the sediment any more than necessary. She was about halfway back when she saw the snake. It emerged from the murk like something from a dream, or a nightmare, depending on your relationship with reptiles. The head came first, broader than a dinner plate, moving through the water with the slow confidence of absolute apex predation. Then the body, coil after endless coil of dark green muscle, each section thicker than Elena's torso. The snake was maybe 4 meters away, close enough that Eleanor could see the individual scales, could make out the pattern of spots and saddles that marked it as an adult female green anaconda. And it was enormous. Easily the largest snake she had ever seen in her career, probably the largest snake she would ever see in her life. Time did that thing it does in moments of extreme experience. It stretched, each second becoming an eternity in which entire lifetimes of thought could occur. Elena's scientific training kicked in automatically, her brain cataloguing observations even as the rest of her consciousness was busy processing the fact that she was floating 4 meters from several hundred pounds of apex predator. The snake's demeanor was calm, not aggressive, not defensive, just curious perhaps, in whatever way a reptile brain experiences curiosity. Its tongue flicked out, tasting the water, gathering information about this strange warm thing that had invaded its territory. Later, Eleanor would describe the encounter to the team in terms that surprised even her. The snake, she said, had seemed almost peaceful, relaxed. It showed no signs of aggression, no defensive posturing, none of the behaviors associated with a threatened or hunting animal. It was simply existing in its element, going about its business, and Elena happened to be in the vicinity. For perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer, human and snake regarded each other across 4 meters of tea-coloured water. 2 intelligent species, both assessing the other, both deciding what to do next. The snake decided first. With a movement so smooth it barely disturbed the water, it turned and glided away, its massive body undulating with the effortless grace that makes constrictors so mesmerizing. Elena watched it go, the tail finally passing her field of vision after what felt like an impossibly long time. Her scientific brain was already calculating. based on the time it took for the entire body to pass, estimating swimming speed, accounting for the curvature of the body. The snake was somewhere between 7.5 and 8 meters long. A genuine giant, quite possibly the same individual they'd spotted from the drone. She surfaced to find the entire team staring at her with expressions ranging from horrified, Marcus, to fascinated, Victor, to something that might have been professional jealousy, Santos, who had spent decades in these waters without an encounter. Quite like that. Eleanor climbed onto the bank, still clutching the ROV, and sat in the mud for a long moment without speaking. When she finally found words, they weren't what anyone expected. She was beautiful, Eleanor said. Absolutely beautiful. The team spent the next several hours at Wara Wara maintaining their distance but hoping for another glimpse of the giant female. They didn't see her again. She had apparently decided that one encounter with humans was quite enough, but the lagoon revealed other wonders. Throughout the afternoon, they documented 7 different anacondas, ranging from juveniles barely 2 meters long to adults pushing 5 meters. The lagoon was clearly a population center, a place where multiple generations of snakes coexisted in a complex social dynamic that science was only beginning to understand. Every observation, every photograph, every data point would contribute to the growing body of knowledge about these remarkable animals. But the expedition's most extraordinary moment was yet to come. On their final morning in the Rupununi, Santos received word from a fisherman that something unusual was happening at a lagoon about 3 kilometers from their camp. The fisherman's description was vague. Many snakes, all together, very strange. But it was enough to send the team scrambling for the boats. What they found when they arrived would become the crowning achievement of the entire expedition. The lagoon was small, maybe 30 meters across, surrounded by dense vegetation that created a natural amphitheater around the water. And in the center of that water, creating ripples that spread to every shore, was something that looked like it had escaped from ancient mythology. At first, Victor's brain couldn't process what he was seeing. It looked like a single massive organism, a hydra perhaps, or some kind of many-headed serpent from Greek legend. Heads emerged from a central writhing mass, tongues flicking, bodies intertwining in a pattern that seemed both chaotic and somehow purposeful. It was a mating ball, and it was spectacular. Green anaconda reproduction involves one of the most dramatic rituals in the animal kingdom. When a female becomes receptive, releasing pheromones that can travel for kilometers through the water, males respond by converging on her location. Sometimes 2 or 3 males might find a single female. Sometimes the number is much higher. In this case, Victor counted at least 12 males, possibly more, all competing for the opportunity to mate with a single large female who was somewhere in the center of that writhing mass. The sight was simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. The snakes moved constantly, their bodies sliding over and around each other in a slow-motion competition that could last for hours or even days. Each male was trying to position himself optimally, to align his body with the female's, to achieve the contact necessary for reproduction, while simultaneously preventing other males from doing the same. There was no violence. Anaconda mating balls are surprisingly peaceful affairs, just constant, patient, determined maneuvering. It was like watching rush hour traffic if all the cars were also trying to reproduce with the bus. Victor stood on the bank, camera forgotten in his hands, simply absorbing the spectacle. This was why he had come to Guyana. Not for measurements or records or data points, though all of those mattered, but for moments like this. Moments when the natural world revealed something so extraordinary, so far beyond normal human experience, that it forced a fundamental recalibration of perspective. These weren't monsters. They weren't villains from bad movies. They were animals doing what animals do, following imperatives written into their DNA millions of years before humans existed. And standing there, watching the mating ball churn and twist in the morning light, Victor finally understood where the legends came from. Imagine being an indigenous hunter, thousands of years ago, stumbling upon a sight like this. Imagine trying to describe it to your village, a mass of serpents, heads emerging from a single body, writhing together in the water like something from a nightmare. Of course the stories grew. Of course the snakes became longer, more numerous, more terrifying with each retelling. The truth was strange enough. Exaggeration was almost inevitable. The mating ball continued for the entire time the team watched, nearly 3 hours, and was still going when they finally had to leave to begin the journey back to Georgetown. The female at the center would eventually choose her mate, or perhaps allow several males to fertilize her eggs, and in 7 months she would give birth to a new generation of giants. The cycle would continue, as it had for millions of years, in lagoons and rivers throughout South America. Humans might come and go, might observe and document and try to understand, but the anacondas would remain. As the boat carried them away from Wara Wara and back towards civilization, Victor reflected on what the expedition had achieved. They hadn't captured a record-breaking specimen. They hadn't produced measurements that would make headlines. What they had done was something perhaps more valuable. They had spent weeks in the world of the green anaconda, observing its behavior, documenting its ecology, witnessing its reproduction. They had met the giants on their own terms, in their own territory, and had emerged with a deeper understanding of what these animals actually were. The green anaconda isn't a monster. It's an apex predator perfectly adapted to its environment, a keystone species that helps maintain ecological balance, a survivor that has outlasted ice ages and volcanic eruptions and everything else nature has thrown at it. It deserves respect, not the fearful respect born of ignorance, but the genuine respect that comes from understanding. And maybe, just maybe, that understanding can help ensure that future generations will still have the chance to experience what Victor and his team had experienced. So that's the story of the giant anacondas of Guyana. Not a tale of monster hunting or near-death encounters, but something better. A story of scientific discovery, of ecological complexity, of animals that are far more interesting than any movie could capture. The legends will persist, as legends do. People will continue to tell stories of snakes the length of rivers, of serpents that swallow villages, of monsters lurking in the deep water. And somewhere in the Rupununi, in lagoons with names like Wara Wara and Karanambu, the real anacondas will continue doing what they've always done. Hunting, breeding, surviving, being exactly what evolution designed them to be. If you made it this far, thanks for joining me on this journey through some of the wildest territory on Earth. Drop a comment letting me know what surprised you most. Was it the mating bulls, the Cayman standoffs, or Elena's underwater face-to-face with an 8-meter legend? And if you want more content like this, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay curious, stay respectful of the natural world, and maybe think twice before swimming in murky South American waters. Peace.